Welcome to this Studium Generale lecture. Nice to see such a full house. Thank you for coming. My name is Jaap Jansen and I'm program maker at Studium Generale. In a split second you decide to go to that party where you actually didn't want to go to, and you end up meeting the love of your life with whom you will be sharing your life for the next 40 years. Or you are sitting on a beach on vacation in some faraway place, and a very old friend just passes by, just like that, coincidentally. Well, unexpected events often strike us as very special. But are they special? Tonight we have a very special guest speaker, and I thank you for coming to Maastricht, all the way from Utrecht. And that's Jeroen Hopster. And he will examine with us the role of chance and coincidence and luck, maybe, in daily life, but also maybe in politics and in science and in society. And Jeroen Hopster is a philosopher and a writer. He is assistant professor of ethics at Utrecht University. He does research on in the fields of technology of ethics and ethics of technology and climate ethics. And he has written a lot of books already. Like there are Toeval, coincidence, Food for Thought, and de andere afslag, about all those what-if moments that we meet in our life. He writes regularly for Filosofie magazine, and he is also the editor of Wijsgerig Perspectief, I believe, if I'm rightly informed, which is also a philosophy magazine. Please give Jeroen a warm applause. Jeroen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jaap. Thank you, audience, for joining. Thank you for being here. This is part of the front cover of a book I authored called Toeval in Dutch. It's a somewhat difficult to translate term, right? It could be chance, it could be coincidence, luck, perhaps not always, but semantically definitely closely related. So I've taken the liberty to translate the term both in chance and coincidence for purposes of tonight. And that's what we'll be talking about: chance, coincidence, luck, their relations, their meaning. Today I also partly go beyond the book. As mentioned by Jaap, difficult to avoid today the topic of donut, the big donut on everyone's mind. But perhaps you've actually come here tonight in order to hear about something else. So let me, instead of talking about the donut on everyone's mind, start with another donut, Donald Duck. And a short part of a Donald Duck cartoon that was originally published in 1953 called Flip Decision. Let me read it to you. Why worry? Let Flipism solve your problems. Comes from this stand. What is Flipism, Donald's thinking. Life holds no terrors when you have embraced the philosophy of Flipism. But what's Flipism? At every crossroad of life, let Flipism chart your course. But what is Flipism? So right, what is Flipism? Any idea? Does any one of you practice Flipism in your daily life? How do you do so? Okay, that's nice to hear. I've had one audience member before who practiced Flipism. He decided by the flip of the coin which clothes to wear, right? So on a daily basis, with all these possibilities, right? Don't spend too much time thinking about that, but have a flip of the coin decide for you instead. Seemed to work well for him, right? Here's another example of what might qualify as Flipism, of a somewhat different sort, right? Flipism in a somewhat more restricted domain, the domain of art, or what one might call aleatoric art, art by the dice, from alia, Latin for die, right? So art that is produced by way of throwing dice, right? This is the result of such an artwork. It was produced by Henk Cornelissen, a Dutch artist, who's worked on this for many years, but only recently completed this, and there will be a new exposition of his work coming up, I think, over the course of upcoming year 2025, of his aleatoric art. And this is one of his masterpieces, one might say. It was what he conceived of as a challenge to chance, whereby it's important to know that chance in Dutch might be translated as Toeval. All right, so that's a 6-letter word. A die has 6 sides to it. So what this artist, Henk Cornelissen, did, he decided, well, we could say that T corresponds to 1, an O to 2, an E to 3, a V to 4, A to 5, and L to 6. Right? And if we have each side of the die correspond to one such letter, we might roll the dice, right? And then one letter will come up. And we'll have like 6 rolls of the dice, and then we'll see which word emerges. And we're going to do that just as long up until the moment that the word toeval, chance, emerges, right? And every time that he like threw the dice 6 times, he made a notation of that, right? And we see the result here, right? So words as oa, oae, or oaeit, livt, coming out of it, right? Just up until the moment that Toeval emerged. He started with this in 1992. He threw the dice approximately 125 times per day, right? And he made all these notations, and then he stopped. So starting in 1992, how long do you think it took him to land at Toeval? Who dares to hazard a guess? 5 years, right? Anything more? Would it have been the 2000s? It was, in fact. It was 11 years and 9 days. 11 years and 9 days, and I have to look it up to be precise, 516,228 throws of the dice he performed up until the moment of January 9th, 2003, when he landed at the word Toeval. Now, I find this a very interesting experiment, a very interesting artwork, right? This is only a small part of it, right? I mean, it's a whole book full of this result, right? Of Henk Cornelis' challenge to chance, uitdaging van het toeval. I find it interesting on the one hand because it seems a very sort of rigid project, right? A project that is very sort of focused on controlling chance, and in that sense, it seems very orthogonal to chance. It seems opposed to chance, right? I mean, chance, isn't that what happens through a confluence of circumstances, right? That we can't sort of rigidly control. So it seems that Henk Cornelissen, he is sort of challenging chance, and he does so in a way that is itself highly controlled and highly stylized, in a highly stylized manner, right? So one might think, well, I mean, isn't he sort of, does his work, his artwork really speak to chance, and is it really a manifestation of what chance is really about or not? And on the other hand, I do think that it shows some interesting aspects of chance, right? Imagine yourself, or imagine Henk Cornelissen, the artist, right? Having his 125 throws per day, him sitting on his desk, and, you know, he throws a T, and he throws an O, and he throws an E, and a V, and then, well, number 5, it might just be an A. And if it is, would the 6th one be an L? Right? You can sort of see how the suspense, right? The excitement of challenging chance and whether it will work or not, and when is the due date going to be, and when will he finally be successful in sort of meeting the challenge, right? You can totally imagine the kind of excitement that it might have given him, right? And I think that's definitely one of the interesting aspects of chance and our way of dealing with it in daily life. The way that chance can breed suspense and can breed excitement, right? And that's also one of the reasons that we might want to invoke chance and be friendly to chance in our lives, right? We might want to be amenable to chance, and we might want to incorporate it in our lives to some degree, because chance can breed excitement, right? So that's one of the things that I think is interesting in the context of chance in life. We're going to get back to that later on. Let me first give you a bit of an overview of what I plan to do over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. Right? So chance, coincidence, and luck, can we control them? Right? I will first say a few words about what I call the philosophy of chance, and specifically the practical turn in the philosophy of chance. Then I will go on saying a few words about chance in life. I think that chance plays various roles in life, and these roles are not always best understood by taking the die and the throw of the dice as our model. I think there might be several models for thinking about chance in life. And I think if you want to have a good grasp of that, right, you might also want to go a bit further than the die alone, right? So we're going to be exploring a bit of an alternative to that. Then thirdly, I want to discuss with you the paradox that is somewhat foundational to this lecture, namely the paradox of exercising agency over chance, that should be, rather than change. Right? So the idea there being that we can exercise some degree of control over chance events, chance encounters. At least that is the thesis that I will be sort of proposing and trying to persuade you of tonight. But that thesis does not seem to be evident, in the sense that actually our dealings with chance might seem to be rather passive, right? Isn't a chance event an event that occurs to you, something that happens to you, something where you are rather passive in the face of external circumstances, right? So thinking about exercising agency over chance, how should we really think about that, right? What does it mean to be able to influence or control or to act on chance? And I will be arguing that there are actually two sort of broad ways in which we can think of this, two broad ways in which we do exercise such agency. We often do it so implicitly, intuitively, but not often reflectively, right? So part of this is making, reflective what we're already doing, but we're not often thinking about it. On the one hand, exercising agency over situational chance in a given situation, right? How might we want to take advantage of chance in a certain situation? And on the other hand, exercising agency over structural chance, that is to say, chance as it manifests itself in social structures, institutions, rules of all sorts, right? And I will be concluding with a few words on the values and the disvalue of chance vis-à-vis control, right? So do we want to invite chance in our life? Do we want to control things, right? Well, we might want to do a bit of both. And there might be certain reasons to prefer having an ingredient of chance for certain practices and having more of an ingredient of control for others, right? Because chance and control, they are sort of attached or associated with different kinds of values, right? So the idea here is also to start to think about that in some more depth. What are the sort of values and disvalues connected with chance and control? Starting with the philosophy of chance and what I call the practical turn. So there's much to say about philosophy of chance. I'm not the first philosopher interested in this topic. And it is a topic, I would say, that there is, a fair degree of discourse on in academia, a fair degree of philosophers, as well as physicists, biologists who are interested on chance in relation to probability, or chance in the context of evolution, or other sort of roles that chance might play, right? I don't think it's it's not one of the main topics of philosophy, but it's definitely a sort of discipline where there's some interest of philosophers and other scientists. But typically that is studied in a very sort of theoretical manner, and the practical aspects of that don't get a lot of emphasis. That is to say, we are thinking about what chance really is, whether it exists, and if so, what does such existence amounts to, right? These are the sort of archetypical philosophical questions about the nature of chance. And much less of this discourse is about how we actually use chance and what kinds of values, disvalues, what kind of reasons for inviting chance or for not inviting chance might be involved in that, right? So when I'm speaking of the philosophy of chance in terms of the practical turn, I mean a turn from the questions of what chance is, if there's such a thing at all, towards the question, what is the value of chance and how should we act on it and let it influence us, right? That's part of the topics or the kind of approach that is central to the book that I've authored on this subject. Now, for any such practical philosophy of chance to get going, I guess that there's a first kind of answer that has to be given to the skeptic who might say, well, such a practical philosophy of chance, it serves no point if there's no such thing as chance to begin with, right? So if chance doesn't exist, why or how can you formulate a practical philosophy for how to go about it, how to deal with it, right? So this is the preliminary challenge. How can we answer the chance skeptic, those who sort of deny the existence of chance to get started with, right? And there might actually be something to such denial, perhaps more so than we tend to think based on experience with flipping coins. Speaking of flipping coins, does anyone know what kind of machine this is? A coin flipping machine, yeah? Have you ever encountered such a machine? It could be, but it would be a rare encounter because, at least to my knowledge, there's only one specimen in existence. There's one such coin flipping machine. It has been built by a professor, or a professor has given the exercise to some of his student bright minds at Stanford University to build it. The professor is a mathematician and statistician, Percy Diaconis. Percy Diaconis worked at Stanford University. He's now an emeritus professor. He also used to be a magician, perhaps not entirely irrelevant, because magicians, they tend to like flipping coins, and they are interested in all the kind of trickery that you can exercise when flipping coins, right? How might you be able to manipulate your audience when you actually flip the coin and when they don't know what's going on there, right? But also as a mathematician, statistician, and with an interest in physics, Diaconis became interested in the actual dynamics of the coin flip, right? So what's actually happening when this coin is flipped and the kind of forces that influence the coin in mid-air and how it flips around, etc. And what turns out, when there is such a machine, where you can see the handle on the left side, and this handle, you pull the lever and the coin, it starts to toss in mid-air and it lands in that red cup. And it turns out that the coin always lands at the same side that it was initially put as its starting point, right? So when it's heads up, it will land heads up. And if it's starting with the coin side up, it will land with the coin side up, right? So in other words, the process of flipping a coin, it can be entirely predictable, right? It can be a predictable process if we are capable of manipulating the initial conditions and the forces operating on it, right? You have to think that this is inside of a lab environment, let's say, where there is no people trembling or shaking the machine. Everything, all these kinds of forces are excluded from it, right? So if we restrict ourselves to the forces that can be influenced and manipulated in a fairly constrained manner, then coin tossing becomes a predictable exercise. Interesting finding, also an interesting finding as a side note, is that Diaconis, together with some colleagues, discovered the following. What do you think if you flip a coin and you grasp it in mid-air? And let's say that we're starting heads up. what do you think is the chance that you, if you grasp it in mid-air, that the coin will be heads up again? Anyone wants to hazard a guess? No one? What would be the obvious thought, right? 50%, right? So that's wrong. It turns out to be 51, close to 51%. So there's a very minor bias when you are flipping a coin towards the side that it's, you know, the side that it's up when starting the flip, when starting the coin toss. There's a small bias towards landing at the same side when you grasp it in mid-air. Why? Well, it has to do something with the sort of the wobble of the coin in mid-air and the kind of the way that, difficult. I mean, there's a quite technical physical explanation there. I'm not gonna dare to give you all the details there, but look it up. Dynamical bias in the coin flip. Interesting article. It doesn't work, of course, when the coin subsequently lands on a table, and then all other kind of forces come into being that make the whole complex much more chaotic and more difficult to predict, and then it sort of equals towards 50%. Right? So what all of this goes to show, and I think what Percy de Cone's experiments nicely illustrate, is that there is a sense in which determinism can be quite real, right? And perhaps more real than we would be inclined to think. I think that flipping a coin, that's a sort of prototypical chance event. But as a matter of fact, right, the outcome of such an event might not be all that chancy, right? So perhaps determinism has a greater sway on the world than we would be inclined to think. So that makes answering the chance skeptic perhaps even more difficult than it might already be at first sight, right? So we had the objection, formulating a practical philosophy of chance serves no point if there's no such thing as chance to begin with. And what is more, prototypical chance events, like flipping a coin, can indeed be deterministically explained, right? So one might say, well, I mean, all the sort of chanciness about this, that can really be relegated to human ignorance. It's just merely a matter of us being unaware of the initial conditions when a coin flip takes place, right? That we don't know and that we can't make a strong prediction of how the coin will end up. So chance, in a real sense, really is a matter of human ignorance. That's an old idea also in philosophy. Spinoza, famous Dutch philosopher, was one of the philosophers propagating this idea that chance really is a sort of measure of human ignorance, a subjective human phenomenon. He called it the asylum ignorantiae, the asylum of ignorance, right? That's the sort of area where the knowledge of chance has to be relegated to. Okay, so that's the challenge to the defender of chance at its strongest, I would think. My reply to it is as follows. Even if we lived in a fully deterministic world, and I do think that that's a very big if, because I think that this whole story, this is interesting for purposes of flipping coins, right? But it sort of bypasses knowledge we have, for instance, about quantum mechanics, right? Which suggests that reality at bottom might really be indeterministic in a more fundamental sense. But it also involves coin flipping in highly stylized, idealized laboratory settings. As soon as an earthquake happens, while Percy de Conis is conducting his experiments, right, then the coin might actually land in a different manner than one would have predicted, right? And that means that chance might still be able to play a role there. And I think that's, that's a small illustration of a much bigger phenomenon, namely that in real life, where we don't work with the sort of isolated logic, where we cannot isolate all the sort of ideal laboratory contexts, where we're not immune for different kind of causal change interacting, it's much more difficult to isolate ourselves from chance, because chance very often occurs when different causal change start to connect and intersect, and when different kinds of events come together and start to get entangled, right? So, I mean, with this very, very long sentence in between, my reply is, even if we lived in a fully deterministic world, which is a very big if, for practical purposes, this world would still be ripe with chance. That is to say, even if, we were be able to conduct experiments like Cornelis does, in practice we don't, we can't. We constantly have to act in a world of uncertainty, and therefore we have to take chance seriously, right? We won't, even if our world were deterministic, we wouldn't have full knowledge such that we can make it predictable. So we still have to act in a world that for our purposes it seems entirely chaotic, unpredictable, and chancy, right? So that is the kind of starting point for me. A small side note here for philosophers of probability. There is also this tendency in philosophy to discuss chance in terms of objective probability, right? So such that when the term chance is used, reference is made to probability in an objective sense. When I'm speaking about chance, I follow the more inclusive linguistic usage, which also refers to different kinds of probability or non-probabilistic manifestations of chance. And I think this wider sort of connotation is actually much more in sync with intellectual history, namely the various ways from ancient Greece up until the present in which chance in its various manifestations has been discussed as a broader phenomenon. What do I mean with this? Well, there is actually quite a rich family of chance concepts, one might say, and a family of closely related concepts, all of which have their own specifics, but which also have some connections. And we have to try to understand what chance is in the context of getting a bit of a grasp of this set of related concepts, right? So, for instance, the concept of coincidence, which could be explained as an unplanned confluence of events that is experienced as surprising or meaningful. Or the concept of contingency, a fragile causal sequence that could have easily yielded a different outcome. Chance is opportunity, right? Taking a chance might also be seeking for opportunities. Chance can have the connotation of probability, of indeterminism. Chance can mean that what occurs spontaneously, that what happens by accident, or that what happens as a matter of good or bad luck. And I don't think that this is an exhaustive overview. I think that there's, this sort of family of chance concepts. They're all related. They all have their own kind of nuances. But when I'm trying to understand what chance is all about, then it's this sort of more varied set of concepts that I have in mind. Okay, good. So against that background of the practical turn in the philosophy of chance, let me start by pointing out, in contradistinction with the example of Henk Cornelissen, the artist throwing the dice, trying to generate Toeval by the dice. My thesis is that the dice are not the best model for chance in life. Right? I already said, think about Cornelissen throwing up until 2001. And then all of a sudden, he would have a stroke, and thereby he wouldn't be able to finish his sequence before the word Toeval had entered on paper. That, for me, would be a typical example of how life, in all its chanciness, would interfere with this project, right? And it would actually be an example of how chance operates in life, right? Because something that is completely independent of the project, the kind of, statistically predictable project of throwing dice up until the moment that you generate this kind of word, right? But life comes in between and it doesn't happen, right? That would be a typical example of chance in life. Another example comes from Aristotle, and I think Aristotle is one of the interesting philosophers who was one of the first to really put chance on the map and give it some serious thought. He did so in his physics, among others. And in his physics, he gives an interesting example, the following. A man is collecting, he's organizing a feast, a big party, and he's going to the market to buy olives and to buy all kinds of vegetables and fruits and whatever he needs for the big party he's organizing. And he enters the market, and there he sees a debtor of his, somebody who owes him money, right? And the debtor, he has just sold an ox, let's say, so he has money readily available to pay his debt. And the debt is thereby resolved, and the man, he can go on and buy all the olives he needs for his feast and organize his big party, right? And what's interesting about this kind of situation, Aristotle says, is that if the man would have known that his debtor would be at the market, he would have certainly gone there in order to get his debt paid for, right? They would have decided to meet there in order to make that happen, to realize the intentions, but they didn't, as a matter of fact, know of each other going there, and their meeting happened as a matter of chance. Right? And what chance does there, or at least one of the qualities I would say it manifests there, is that chance can often be have some kind of cleverness, some kind of intelligence. Some things happen as if they were planned to occur like that, right? If we would have given it any thought, if we would have planned things along, or with our own intelligence, we might have thought of this kind of scheme whereby the man went to the market in order to get his debt repaid. But it happened by chance, right? So chance there, it seems to be a kind of cause, or it seems to be, closely related to other kinds of causes, but it's also a cause that has this kind of sort of interesting quality of having a sort of producing an intelligent kind of result. Or at least a result that strikes us as meaningful and that is useful in some kind of way. Many of the examples that go by the term of serendipity also have this quality. So how I think of chance is, and specifically how chance manifests itself in real life, is in terms of this confluence of events, right? Think of several causal chains that, that go on by their own logics and that suddenly get entangled and they produce together a new kind of event, right? And they become one and they start to merge and they shape trajectory, they give shape to reality in a new kind of way, right? I think that's very typical of chance events, not only in life, right? You meet some other person and, you fall in love and it becomes your partner, and that's the kind of chance event that might shape your own life. But also in human history, right? How events that happen to occur at similar times, but occurred independently because of separate logics, independently become entangled, and because of their timing, because they happen simultaneously, or because a person was at the right time at the right moment, something like that. That becomes a sort of meaningful confluence, a meaningful synchronicity, so to say, and thereby the event takes a new kind of shapes and become more structuring of reality as such. So I think that's the general kind of picture I have in mind here. That chance in life typically manifests itself as a confluence of events, and that these events get entangled even though their causes themselves are separate, independent. They operate by different logics. And this kind of falling together of events, this idea that chance occurs in a meeting of events, so to say, it's also at bottom of many of the origins of chance notions. Many of the different notions, words we use to indicate chance phenomena, they have their etymological roots in the Latin verb cadere, to fall. Right? Think of the word coincidence that entered the English language around 1600 from the French coïncidence, from coïncider, from medieval Latin coincidere, literally to fall upon together, from a simulated form of Latin, com, with, together, plus incidere, to fall upon, whereby incidere comes from in, upon, plus cadere, to fall. Right? So falling, the element of falling, cadere, is there, and the togetherness, right? Things falling together in a certain way. Same holds for chance, also comes from cadre, entered English around 1297 from French séance. Accident, the falling of dice, from Latin cadentia, that which falls out, from cadentem, ultimately from cadre, to fall. Right? So I think that this, giving an etymology, it's never a proof of anything, but it does go to show that there's an interesting kind of historical connection, the way that words find their way into language, into thought, and the kind of associations, metaphors, images that are coming with chance events. They often derive from this idea of falling together. And I do think that that's actually that's actually reflecting a deeper significance of what chance in life is very much about. So that would be my model of chance in life, the model of meeting, falling together, right? Now, against this background, let's go into this paradox that I briefly mentioned before, the paradox of exercising agency over chance. How is such a thing possible? Aren't we at the mercy of chance? This is at least something that has long been thought and also been very much a part of the kind of intellectual and also the popular tradition of thinking about chance. For instance, these kinds of images that were highly popular in the medieval period of Fortuna, the goddess of chance, spinning her wheel, the rota fortunae, or the wheel of chance. Right? So Fortuna gives the wheel a spin, and in doing so, she can actually turn upside down world events. We see the king there sitting on top of the wheel, but because of the spin of the wheel of Fortuna, the king might all of a sudden land down at the bottom and might lose everything, right? So because of Fortuna, kingdoms might suddenly find their demise, whereas some people who would never expect it, they might land up on top, right? We are very much at mercy of what chance does to us, how she spins our wheel, what happens to us, right? That's a sort of common idea, a common sort of connotation, common way of thinking about chance. We see it also very much so in the ideas of the Stoics, for instance, in Seneca. Nominus saepe fortuna in nos incurrit quam nos in illam. Fortune runs into us as often as we run into it, Seneca says, right? And the idea there being conveyed is that we might want to be seeking chance, seeking fortune, right? Having fortune come our way. But as a matter of fact, we should better be prepared and better be aware that we might easily lose our fortune in the face of chance, right? The way that chance might turn events upside down, we might all of a sudden lose everything. So Seneca says the wise man, and that's an idea that's very much part of the Stoic tradition, the wise man had better sort of shield their fortune from the influences of chance and luck, right? And be self-sufficient and not make their fortune depend too much on external events that are beyond their own control, let's say. Now, I think that this is a too short-sighted way of looking at things. In particular, I think that there's more to the agency that we can actually exercise over chance than mere retreat, right? So, of course, we should be somewhat diligent. We should think about how we can lose things in the face of chance. But we should also acknowledge the fact that we are not merely sort of passive recipients, passive spectators of what chance brings to us and the good or bad fortune she brings to us. But we might also be taking on a more sort of active posture and might exercise a relevant degree of agency in the face of chance. And I will be explaining what I'll mean by that in a moment, right? Let's start, though, with the paradox of controlling chance and the kind of challenge that raises, right? So one might object, well, a lack of control, that's actually a defining aspect of chance situations and outcomes, right? When we speak about chance, it seems that we're speaking about something that cannot be controlled in a relevant sense. Exercising agency, on the other hand, involves having a relevant degree of control over a situation or an outcome, right? But if chance pertains to that which cannot be controlled, then how can we exercise agency over it? How can we exercise agency, for instance, over fortuitous coincidences, right? Like the coincidence that Aristotle described of the person organizing a big party encountering his debtor at the market, right? Or how can we exercise agency over our life chances, right? Think of your own life as having its starting conditions determined symbolically, let's say, or metaphorically by a spin of the wheel of fortune, right? Isn't that something that simply befalls us, right? And isn't that something that we really are passive recipients of and that we cannot influence in any meaningful sense? So how can we exercise agency over chance? Well, I think we can do so in two broad manners, right? Which correspond with two manifestations of chance in life. And in describing these, I will be borrowing a distinction made by the Dutch sociologist Thijs Bol between situational chance and structural chance. And my thesis is that in the face of either of these, there is, in fact, a relevant degree of agency that we can exercise and that we also should exercise. Right? So we should become more cognizant of our agency in the face of chance, and we should actually act upon that. Right? Let me give some examples, starting with this example from Alexander Fleming, well-known bacteriologist, also well-known for the way that he first made his big discovery of penicillin, right? The first antibacterian. How did he discover penicillin? Well, Fleming, he was a very sort of careful scientist. He made all these kind of what are they called again in English? These preparaten in Dutch. He prepared all these little petri dishes with bacteria, and then he was investigating how the bacteria grow. And then he left his various petri dishes in the lab one day, and he returned the next day, and a fungus had landed on one of the petri dishes. And interestingly, he discovered that around this fungus, the bacteria were no longer growing. Okay? So he discovered that bacteria no longer grow around this specific fungus, and he thereby made the inference that this fungus is actually antibacterial. Right? And this was very much, one might say, a chance discovery, a discovery where chance played a sort of helping hand. But it was also a discovery that was, aided by the fact that Fleming himself had the clarity of mind and was sufficiently clever himself to make the link that it was actually this fungus inhibiting the bacterial growth, right? And this might also be relevant in a broader context, and it might actually be of medicinal value, right? So yes, it was a chance discovery, but it was also a chance discovery whereby chance interacted with the cleverness of Fleming himself, let's say. Right? And I think that's very typical of how we can, and certain people perhaps better so than others, use chance to their advantage. Right? By being sort of sharp in the senses, sharp and clever, making certain connections that others don't see, and thereby, thereby building on the affordances that the situation offers, so to say. Right? So, not everybody might be equally well equipped psychologically or equally well trained in order to make use of the chance events that happen in a certain situation. But if you are, then you are using situational chance to your advantage, right? So exercising agency in the face of situational chance, it involves what is often also called the practice of serendipity, the art of the onset finding, right? You find something that you were not initially looking for, but you come on its track, and thereby you become engaged by that phenomenon, and you actually start to incorporate it and look at it more carefully. And if you look at the history of science, it's quite remarkable and very interesting that many kinds of relevant discoveries were often serendipitous discovery. They often have this kind of serendipitous nature, this chanciness in the process of discovery. Right? Why so? Well, because in part, the scientists who were coming in the situation where this kind of phenomena occurred, because they had the sort of sharpness of mind to actually conclude that these were important observations, and they can take these observations and incorporate them into their theories. Right? So serendipity, it's partly a character trait, partly a sort of disposition, a mental disposition to take advantage of whatever chance might arise in a certain situation and take advantage of that in a certain way. Right? So that's the first way of resolving the paradox of controlling chance, right? We had the challenge, if chance pertains to that which cannot be controlled and agency involves control, then how can we exercise agency over chance? Right? And I think a first kind of reply that might be offered here, well, even in context of situational chance, we typically retain a relevant form of agency, right? We can still either overlook what's going on, or we can actually pay attention to it and thereby sort of take it to the next step, right? Think of this quote by Arthur Schopenhauer, Das Schicksal mischt die Karten und wir spielen, right? So where is agency there? Fate is mixing the cards, but we are playing, right? So we are playing the hand that fate is dealing to us, but we can exercise agency in terms of that hand, right? So there's both the sort of passive spectator aspect, but also the active agency enacting aspect in there. And I think that's actually very typical of many of the situations in which we are dealing with chance, right? And some people might be better at exercising such agency than others, right? Some are more masters of serendipity than others. It also holds this exercising agency in the face of chance for what might at first sight appear to be circumstances where no agency is involved at all. Prototypical coincidences, think about coincidences as something, right? Again, that befalls you, something that you cannot plan, right? A nice example occurred in 2013. This was the year that Joseph Ratzinger abdicated as Pope, Benedictus XVI. He was as a Pope, and it was quite a notorious moment because popes before Benedictus XVI didn't abdicate. That is to say, the last abdication as a pope was somewhere many, many centuries ago. Normally, popes, they remain in their function up until they die, and they don't give away their function, they don't abdicate before their life is over. But Ratzinger, he did abdicate prematurely, and this was in 2013, and the night that he announced his abdication, lightning struck St. Peter's Basilica. Remarkable event, a remarkable coincidence, quite striking. It was, of course, picked up by the media. It was also picked up by social media on what was back then Twitter. Garrett Gutierrez, for instance, remarked that lightning struck the Basilica after the Pope resigned. It's a sign. Or Alan Fincher remarking, lightning struck St. Peter's in the Vatican City after the Pope resigned. Does God have workable knowledge of Photoshop? Right? Interesting, funny. You see that it's difficult to recognize or to accept chance as chance, right? It's very tempting to look at sort of underlying causes that explain away the chanciness of the situation. But I think that this was really a chance event, and I think there's also good evidence, and we are better sort of positioned to appreciate that if we look at what the photographer who made this image has to say about it, Filippo Monteforte. He recounted later when in an interview that he took the picture from St. Peter's Square while sheltered by the columns. It was icy cold and the rain was falling in sheets. When the storm started, I thought that lightning might strike the rod, so I decided it was worth seeing whether, if it did strike, I could get a shot at exactly the right moment. The first bolt was huge and it lit up the sky, but unfortunately I missed it. I had better luck the second time and was able to snap a couple of images of the dome illuminated by the bolt. So what I found interesting here about this way that Monteforte recounts what he was actually doing is that, once again, one sees that he was not merely a sort of passive spectator of an event that occurred and he was at the right place at the right time. I mean, he was, but he was also there because of his own agency, right? He decided that it would be strategic for him to go to St. Peter's on such a stormy night, and he thought that, well, perhaps there's an interesting shot there in the making. He also had several attempts, and some of them failed, right? So he also tried his luck by sort of, getting statistics to work in his favor, so to say, right? So there are different ways in which he is sort of actively positioning himself in the face of situational chance. He's acting on situational chance, right? And I think, again, as said, that's very typical of serendipity. Serendipitous discoveries, they're not merely discoveries that sort of happen to us. They happen to us and we act on them, right? We use our intelligence in the face of what the situation has to offer, right? And that's where chance really becomes interesting and becomes a sort of helpful and important ingredient in life and or action itself, right? So to resolve the paradox of controlling chance, if chance pertains to that which cannot be controlled and agency involves control, then how can we exercise agency over chance? Well, my first reply is we, as individuals, we often retain a relevant degree of agency in context of situational chance. In other words, this sort of opposition between chance and control, it should become a bit less sharp, right? There is actually a relevant sense in which we can also control the chanciness of events themselves. And I think there's also a second reply. We, as a society, can exert agency over the way and degree to which chance is ingrained in social practices and institutions. And that brings us to this second notion that I've used, the notion of structural chance. So what is structural chance? An example I like to give involves the game of tennis. I'm a tennis player, and it often happens, well, not often, but sometimes in the dynamics of a good rally that all of a sudden the ball hits the top side of the net, right? And then, I mean, as all of you who've played some tennis, and even those of you who haven't but have watched it on television are surely aware, when the ball hits the top side of the net, then basically all bets are off. Anything can happen, right? You might become lucky and the ball will fall on the side of the opponent in a way that's impossible for them to ever, get back. You might get unlucky and it might sort of, fall back on your side and you lose the point. So basically, this is something that you can't influence, can't control in a relevant sense. Even the best players nowadays, Yannick Sinner, Djokovic, whomever, they're very trained and skilled, but they wouldn't have the precision of their shot to actually hit for the top side of the net, right? That's something that you can't really control yourself as a player, right? Nonetheless, it does happen with some sort of regularity in the tennis game. And it can be quite sort of influential as to whether you win the point or not. And it also influences the dynamics of the rally, right? Often the rallies become very sort of interesting, engaging. There's a sort of total flip of the dynamics, let's say, and the rallies tend to take an interesting course when the ball hits this side of the net, right? Now, one might think it's rather unfair because you don't have any relevant control over the outcome. So we shouldn't let the points in a game be decided on whether you got lucky or not, right? If there's no relevant degree to which you can influence the outcome, it would be unfair to give a point to the winner of such a rally purely based on chance, right? So, and as a matter of fact, of course, we can make a new tennis rule, a rule for the game of tennis, which says you're not allowed to score points by hitting the ball on the top side of the net, right? So these points could be discounted, disqualified, let's say. But we don't do so. We don't want to exclude making such points from the game of tennis. In fact, we want to keep them in. Why so? Well, because it gives the rallies an interesting dynamic, because we actually like the idea that rallies can have these surprising dynamics, and because we like the fact that all bets are off and that the tables can turn. So perhaps we are sometimes more interested in this kind of interesting dynamics of the rallies, rather than whether it's entirely a fair manner of making a point and winning the point or not. And that's something we can influence in virtue of the rules of the game. And I think that is actually an example how we can influence the rules, can influence the structure of the game, that one might apply to sports and to other kinds of games, but also to all kinds of societal settings, right? Think about, again, the Wheel of Fortune, the Rota Fortunae. We know a contemporary version of this, which is the Wheel of Fortune, het Rad van Fortuin, as it's played in many television shows. And like in the television shows, right? I mean, we can have an influence on which kinds of options are on the table. If you actually spin the wheel, whether you might get bankrupt, whether you might have great winnings or not, right? What is actually possible, that might be very much up to us as a society, right? So think again of the Wheel of Fortune as a sort of wheel of life. Do you get born in a very wealthy or in a very poor family? Well, for you, that might be a matter of chance, a matter that you can't influence. But for us as a society, we can influence the chances that new people will get born in a relatively wealthy or poor environment, right? And to what extent these are highly unequal or more equal, right? These are kinds of outcomes that we can influence as a society, for instance, by having more or less progressive tax measures, etc. Right? So we might devise certain institutions that might aggravate inequality or make it less so, and thereby influence life chances and also the role of chance in life by changing societal structures, very much like you can change or influence the game of tennis with different kinds of rules. You know? And I think this holds for, for life and inequality and distribution of wealth, right? Do you get born with the golden crown in the cradle or not? But think also of the design of our technologies, right? Think of the design of dating apps, and think of the ways in which we can sort of exercise control and influence who crosses our path, versus leaving this very much to chance, to serendipitous encounters. And there might be something to be said for that. At least to some degree, we might want to think, well, perhaps we shouldn't exercise too much control there, but we actually like to, to have the ability to let people from different walks of life meet each other. So thinking about chance versus control is actually quite important in how we structure society, in how we structure technologies, in how we make all kinds of decisions that involve, structures and institutions. Yeah. So let me finish then by highlighting some of the values and some of the disvalues of designing for chance and designing against chance, so to say. Right? What are some of the values and what are some of the virtues of chance? Well, I've given you some examples to make the point that chance and the role of chance in life itself, it can enhance creativity, it can enhance suspense, right? There might be all kinds of trajectories, outcomes that we hadn't planned ourselves, and that are actually generating interesting dynamics we find worthwhile, whereby our own creativity, so to say, is enhanced by what chance has to offer to us. The element of surprise and the element of playfulness, these might also be values or virtues that we actually think are interesting and worth striving for, right? Think about Donald Duck. He was ultimately persuaded by the Flipists, so he became a Flipist himself, and he starts to let the coin flip decide whether he goes left or right with the car and which trajectory to follow. And he's enjoying that very much because, you never know where you're going to end up with. And it's a very sort of exciting way to go on a car ride. Right? I mean, that's, at least in the comic, it works out well for him initially. Later, not so much. Lack of bias and openness. So letting chance decide. It might also be a good instrument of de-biasing and to be open to things that we might otherwise not be open to. Including all kinds of biases that might emerge in patterns of technology, for instance, biases about who would meet who, right? We might actually want to design with an architecture of serendipity in order to facilitate chance encounters that make people look beyond their own kind of bubble, so to say. There might be all kind of positive societal implications of that. Fairness and efficiency, right? Think of how a football match gets started with a referee making a flip of the coin. Is that fair? Yes, because there is no sort of skill involved. It's simply a measure of making a quick decision and in a way that all kind of parties can agree with and don't oppose to. And a coin flip can be very useful as an instrument for that. So there are settings, context and ways in which we want to embrace chance, but there are also contexts in which we do not. There are certain disvalues and vices of chance. Importantly, chance does seem to impinge on our agency if we leave too much to it, right? To just finish the comic of Donald Duck. So he ends up making all these decisions with the coin flip on where to drive, but of course he ends up driving on the wrong way, on a one-way road, right? And he has to appear for court. And then I'm moving to the last part here of the judge, who says, "Well, I'm not going to judge you for driving on the wrong side of the coin, the wrong side of the road. I'm not going to give you a sentence for that, but I am going to fine you $50 for letting a dime do your thinking for you. Right? In other words, Donald Duck, he was only relying there on the dime for making his own decisions. He was outsourcing his own thinking, his own agency. He let the coin flip decide. And there might be contexts where we actually don't want that to happen, right? We want people to do their own thinking and not let the coin decide. So surrendering agency can be useful in certain contexts, but not always, and can also be quite a sacrifice. There might also be contexts where, letting the coin decide is highly unfair. Think about situations where merit really matters, right? Thinking about a judge, for instance, yielding his verdict by a flip of the coin. We would immediately say, no, that's not the right way to make a verdict. Why not? Well, because certain people merit punishment and others do not, right? So desert seems to be important, and the coin flip is not the right instrument for doing so. It would be highly unfair. Letting coins decide, it can instill uncertainty. Uncertainty can generate suspense. That's the positive side of it. But the flip side is it can also engender nagging doubt. Uncertainty can be addictive, right? So there are all kinds of chance settings where actually the result is people becoming addicted gamblers, right? Which is something that we might want to avoid. Letting chance decide can lead to dangerous risk, and chance can also be quite destructive in its chaotic aspects. So to conclude, should we join the Flippists? Well, I don't think we should, right? I think it would be unwise, and it would also be unethical to live by the dice alone, right? Don't sort of take up the coin and let the coin make all the decisions for you. The heuristic for a practical philosophy of chance, as far as I'm concerned, is not to leave too much to chance, but also not too little up to it. Because, first of all, we have to reflect on the practical importance of chance, how it can affect us. And I think that inviting chance in certain practices, domains of life, it can have some surprising benefits, right? So it would be important for us to reflect on that a bit more, how chance can actually be helpful for certain practices. We can exercise more agency over chance than we tend to think. And chance, we should keep in mind, comes with a variety of different qualities. So we should also strike an appropriate balance between chance and control per domain and think what kind of qualities chance can add for a given domain and which it cannot. I will conclude with a brief quote by Vladimir Nabokov, the writer in Laughter in the Dark, which nicely illustrates, I think, that when we think about chance, we can exercise some control. And we really can, but we should also keep in mind that chance and coincidence, they also have their workings of their own, and our control can never be full. As Nabokov wittily wrote, a certain man once lost a diamond cufflink in the wide blue sea, and 20 years later, on the exact day, a Friday apparently, he was eating a large fish, but there was no diamond inside. And that's what I like about coincidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeroen, for your interesting lecture. Any questions? Yes, okay.
I didn't hear you speak about predetermination. Is that something what you don't see as a chance?
Mm-hmm. So predetermination, I understand in the philosophical sense as not merely being determination, but also predetermination in a deeper sense. For instance, in the sense that everything that occurs at a later stage is predetermined by, what happened in advance. And perhaps even in an even deeper sense that predetermination involves some kind of fatalism, that we can never escape the kind of fate that we are sort of doomed to have, right? I think that that's not an aspect of chance. I think it's opposed to chance, right? So I think that if we would be fatalists in a strong sense, then it would be difficult to think about any real sense of chance. I think if we are less strong and think about a deterministic world, so not the predeterminism where everything, is sort of predetermined and preordained in a sense that leaves no room for agency at all, but a deterministic world and where causes have certain effects and where we are part of that sort of causal nexus. There, I think chance might play a more relevant role, and I think that the story that I've been giving is compatible with the deterministic view. Yeah.
So if people say it's written in the stars, that's not typically fatalism, but that's more like I think that was meant for me to happen.
Yeah. So I'm typically not a strong believer in that. There might, of course, be circumstances where something occurs and you might think, well, that was meant to happen in the sense that if I would have, if I could turn back time and make some small change, it would not have made a difference because the result would have been the same nonetheless, right? So I think that's a sense, and there can be circumstances when that's actually an adequate or a proper idea, I think. So that's it. So I could go along with that, but I think that also that appeal tends to be made a bit too easily. It was written in the stars, I could do no other. Well, that remains to be seen.
Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you. Hello. More than a question, it was like a train of thoughts that I have been following after your lecture. You commented about allowing more chance to come into our lives. And I was wondering how we have been losing this ability to allow chance because we tend to control more variables. We have more tools, we can predict more, we get anxious if we don't have adequate control. So I was wondering how it was written in the stars before, or was the God's will or the destiny has been loosened in terms of giving more value to control, to predictability, to narrowing down the uncertainties, to managing risk better. So, and how society has been reacted to that, how that affects us as society, as individuals, in terms of giving less value to the chance and more value to control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I do think that in general terms, there might be an overemphasis on control in the sense that we as a society might think that many big kind of problems can be managed by controlling them, right? We have to control climate change, for instance, by keeping global temperature rise to 1.5 up until 2 degrees. I'm not saying that that's not a good ambition to strive for. I think we should definitely do strive for it. But I also think that it sort of reflects a somewhat managerial mindset where we actually think that we might be able to have this kind of the ability to exercise control to such a degree that we can sort of have this precise kind of outcome. And I think that's often not the case. I think we are acting in a context where our control tends to be much more limited. And I think it's important to acknowledge that our control might be more limited. But I also think that it's important to acknowledge that that's not always a bad thing, right? So when it comes to climate change, it might be a bad thing because that's a context where risk is great and where risk, can be defined as the probability of a negative outcome. So that's definitely something we want to avoid. But chance doesn't only have to bring bad things, right? Chance can also bring good things. Think about serendipity in science, but also in life itself. And creating room as a society for serendipity and for serendipitous encounters, that might actually be the kind of example of where we want to let go of control a bit more, right? So in general, I would say we are a bit too much control focused. We think that we can sort of manage the bad stuff, and we don't think enough about how we can invite the good stuff.
You mentioned the experiment with Henk Cornelissen and the dice and the word Toeval. I can imagine that artificial intelligence is able to program such an experiment. And in talking in terms of control, that these types of experiments will be more repeated and less dependent on the human factor, so to say. So I was wondering how you think of artificial intelligence and how it might influence these types of experiments.
Yeah. That's a nice question. I was asked to write a short contribution to a Festschrift for Henk Cornelissen, and I used that exact same example in my contribution. I mean, what I think is interesting about Henk Cornelissen's work is that it reflects the enormous effort, namely 11 years and 9 days of throwing dice, into something that AI could generate in 1 millisecond, right? And I also think that that's, you know, the whole work itself, and part of its artistic value is precisely that it reflects that effort, right? And you kind of sort of read the effort into all these sort of mentions, these failed attempts at generating Toeval. AI could generate the same booklet in a millisecond, and you know, it would be on paper the exact same result, but without that origin story, it would be completely uninteresting, right? So I think there's an interesting dynamic there, but I don't think that it overtakes the value of Henk Cornelissen's work immediately. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. My question is in relation to the first one. You hinted sort of to a degree to it, but it seems like the debate of human agency is coming back in fashion a little bit lately. So you kind of hinted that compatibilist side that Daniel Dennett used to hold is something that you sympathize with, correct me if I'm wrong, but someone like Robert Sapolsky and his argument for determinism on the level of the brain seems quite convincing to me, and the argument from compatibilism always seemed like he was dodging the kind of the issue at it. So given the rise in neuroscience and scientific method, what would it take for you, for example, to be convinced that human brain is fully determined and that something like human agency is just a billiard balls hitting one another in domino effect? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm somewhat familiar with the work of Sapolsky, but undoubtedly you very much more so. I mean, the way that I have come to think about causation more and more is in terms of the important role, basically, of sort of chaos theory and chaotic dynamics in processes of causation. It might turn out that what we, call free will or think about in terms of agency, it has something to do with unpredictability as a result of chaos. But I also think, and I'm not sure whether Sapolsky has formulated an answer to this, but I think a sort of a challenge that remains for his kind of position is that a lot of action, also my action here, it's partly, of course, a lot of sort of, actions that are determined by my neuronal, by my brain and by all kinds of automated processes. But for instance, my decision to give this lecture here and to invite, to accept Jaap's invitation, I think that also had an aspect of reflection and to considering the reasons I would have for accepting the invitation versus declining it, etc. And I think at that level of description, agency still comes in, right? Reflecting on our reasons, endorsing certain reasons rather than others. And, I think that that's the kind of level where we really have to think, that we have to take seriously if we take free will seriously. Right? So that would be my answer there. I'm not sure to what extent Sapolsky is also sympathetic to that line, but that would be a line that I take seriously. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to make a little comment. It's not a question as much. You included a tweet, and I don't think it is very appropriate nor respectful to make fun of any religion in any kind of academic professional setting. So yeah, just for future reference.
Sure. I mean, I don't think I'm making fun of any kind of religion, though, right? I mean, of course, you might not accept certain explanations given your religious beliefs, etc. But you might also be, have certain religious beliefs and still think that the idea that lightning struck the Vatican City on the day that the Pope abdicated, and that, does God have workable knowledge of Photoshop? It's a remark that's being made, but I don't think it's a mockery of religion as such. But I mean, if you have a different interpretation of that, that's fine, of course.
Any more comments? If not, no hands? Yes? Okay, yeah.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. You stated before that we should accept more coincidence and randomness in our life. How should we do that? Just say always yes to every opportunity, or how do we open it up?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part?
Yes, so before you stated that we should be more open to coincidence, to chance, because we have always been more of a controlled society. Mm-hmm. How can we actually open them? Should we say yes? There's the whole philosophy about always say yes to every opportunity. Would that be the one to take the chance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, difficult question because it's quite. It's somewhat general. I mean, I think the starting point would be to acknowledge that we can actually exercise some agency here, right? So we tend to think, well, I mean, chance is what happens to us, and we seek control. And I mean, I think the first sort of change of mind that would be useful for individuals as well as for societies in all kinds of decision contexts is to think, well, I mean, we can also, leave certain things to chance here, and that might be actually beneficial for the process, right? So, a boss might decide not to micromanage his employees because that is actually sort of detrimental to the relations, and sort of leaving that open might yield a context where the employees are more inclined to take control and undertake action in a way that is much more beneficial for the situation as a whole. Right? So I think the starting point would be to realize that there is more that we can do than sort of taking control. There's also leaving things to chance that might actually be beneficial. And then the second point would be to really reflect on, okay, given this specific context or given this specific domain, what are the values of leaving it open, leaving it to chance, leaving it undecided, versus taking control and making it more sort of structured, right? And I mean, I don't think that it's always the case that we should sort of leave it open, or always the case that we should take control. I mean, there's, as I've highlighted, there's different sort of values that come into play, and we have to make a kind of case-to-case decision on that basis. But an awareness of that whole sort of spectrum of possibilities, that's for me the starting point. Yeah.
Okay, no. One last question and then we will wrap up.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. I have a question. I'm not very sure about myself, but I thought I might just well shoot it. I was wondering if you view personally chance as a fundamental property of reality, or more of a illusionary concept? Because if you ask me, I think I agree more with the second, because it somehow always involves a human agent. Mm-hmm. I assume. I agree more with Spinoza in that sense, that it's for one to view chance, you have to subject yourself to ignorance to a certain extent, and that's also why it's always relative to who perceives it, with background knowledge and whatnot. Mm-hmm. That indeed, there's also the quantum physics, but even maybe there, I can imagine cavemen not really thinking the same way about the weather as we think about quantum physics. We just don't know the rules that happen on such a small level, or maybe we will never know. I don't know. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. I mean, my answer would be that you have to think about what you mean by reality, right? And I think that the tendency, very strongly so, also as reflected in the way that you're posing the question, is to think about reality ultimately as that what happens at a sort of micro level as studied by physicists. And I think that that's actually a somewhat limited view of what reality is all about in its sort of full dimension and manifestations. I think that human reality, while the quantum level is part of that, it's not a very significant part of that. And I think many other sort of phenomena are much more salient to us and much more important. And at the level at which I perceive of human reality, I think that chance most certainly is a real aspect of that. So I think that chance is real in human reality, right? And human reality in all its fullness. And my argument against the sort of more physicalist strand or the tendency to reduce it to the physical level would be to say, well, I mean, that's quite a sort of limited view of what reality is all about, right? I mean, of course, if you would take that question, then it becomes a matter of what are your interpretations of quantum mechanics, etc. And I think that's an interesting debate, but it's not necessarily, I would be sympathetic to the idea that, that there's a real level of indeterminacy there. But I also think that that's ultimately not the right kind of answer to that question. I think we have to think about human reality in all its fullness, and there I think that chance really does exist. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. I hope to see you another time at Studium Generale. We have an international comedy night coming up and a lecture about the economics of sustainability. I would like to thank you for your lecture. Thank you again, and thank you for coming. Please, one last round of applause for Jeroen Hopster.